Hello, welcome to Week 5, Sociology of Crime. My name is William Wood. This week we're looking at social disorganization and social ecological perspectives. In this first lecture, we'll be looking at the Chicago School and the birth of social ecology, some of the basic assumptions of this approach, as well as some of the social changes that precipitate the rise of the Chicago School in the development of Chicago as a major industrial city in the United States. In Lecture 2, we'll look at the research of the Chicago School in more detail up through the late 40s and 1950s. And then we'll look in the last lecture for the week at the fall and eventual return of social disorganization theory and research in the latter 20th and 21st centuries. So let's go ahead and get started. This term Chicago School is shorthand for a group of works that emerged from researchers at the University of Chicago, the United States, following World War I. The term social ecology was used by these researchers. They were quite influenced by plant ecology, this notion that some species, move invasively into other plant ecosystems, in turn affecting the indigenous plants there, reconfiguring plant ecosystems, etc. And they were influenced in particular in relation to the massive changes or upheavals that happened in Chicago during this time, which we'll speak about in this lecture. There's also a link there that you should take a look at that gives you a little bit more background in this concept of social ecology. So the University of Chicago was the home of the first sociology department in the United States, established in 1892. Many of these scholars studied in Germany, some of them under the sociologist Max Weber that we looked at in Week 1. If you recall, Weber's interest in things like social stratification meant that he was far more focused, and the Germans on the whole, far more focused on things like culture or social class or other variables had on the ability to shape or constrict or enable people's individual social actions. So this was in contrast to the Italians that we looked at last week, Lombroso, Garofalo, etc., who tended to reduce these to individual physiological or psychological level variables. The biggest influence was undoubtedly the city of Chicago itself and the massive social changes that happened from about 1870 to 1920. So it's established as a small town in the 1800s, an outpost town in terms of American history. However, the advent of cheap labor and really inexpensive land, Chicago, for the most part, is an extremely flat city. So land could be purchased at this point for very, very little, far cheaper than the land in eastern seaports, Boston, New York, etc. So this attracted unskilled workers needed to facilitate growth. Chicago doubled in size in about 30 years between the end of the 1800s and 1930. During this time, waves of immigrants, with the exceptions of World War I, waves of immigrants turned what was a small town into a large and complex industrial urban center. This was facilitated as well by the growth of the railroads. New technologies, in turn, however, automation in particular, replaced the need for unskilled labor, resulting in increases in unemployment or severe underemployment. This in turn creates social problems in terms of housing, homelessness, vice, youth gangs, and so on. So by the early 20th century, crime is seen as an increasing social problem in Chicago. Much of the blame for this is laid at the feet, not surprisingly, of new waves of immigrants, ethnic or racial immigrants. This is an old story in America, one we're unfortunately seeing repeated today. The ethnic melting pot, part of the American dream, came to be seen as enabling or creating of the conditions for increased criminality. So throughout this time of these massive social changes that are happening, and we'll go into them in a little more detail in a moment, these academics at the University of Chicago are looking at these significant changes, looking at Chicago as a type of a laboratory, believing the city to be a natural human environment or a microcosm of the human experience. with the assumption that, that human behavior is influenced by their surrounding social and physical environment. So what became known as the Chicago School really relied on two sets of data. And here we have some pretty unique contributions, which to this day were profound in the development of sociology and particularly criminology as a discipline. One is that these researchers were really some of the first within the study of crime and delinquency. Other researchers had done it in things like epidemiology, healthcare, etc. But in terms of the study of crime and delinquency and similar behaviors, the Chicago School were really some of the first researchers to go and look at official data, things like crime rates, crime reports, housing records, welfare records, etc. And also some of the first to go into the city itself. All right, so this is a term that we've looked at already, or for those of you that have done the weekly review reading for week 2 in Philippe Bourgois' work, Righteous Dopefin, this example of ethnography, where the researchers from the Chicago School went into the city and studied more intimate aspects of the social world and social relationships, particularly from immigrant populations or newer populations within more socially disorganized areas. They interviewed, they observed, particularly problems in terms of transitioning from social behaviors in the old world to the new one. So this research Chicago style involved the use of both quantitative analysis and collection of official data, and also qualitative observational or participatory type of research. Out of this came several basic assumptions that became a hallmark or became foundational for this Chicago School approach. This is an approach that views crime and deviance as caused by social or environmental factors, not rational choices or pathological traits. So in this sense, the social disorganization perspective, and with this we should probably add the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was not really part of the Chicago School per se, but in many ways whose research as well. He was the first African-American PhD awarded by Harvard University, and a voracious intellect, and in many ways he anticipated a lot of the Chicago School, but along with the work of Du Bois and a few other notable early 20th century academics, the Chicago School and the observations made by social ecologists in the early 20th century are really the first primarily social explanations of deviance and crime. So this approach suggests that crime and deviance, while perhaps undesirable, are a somewhat natural result of rapid social change, the disintegration of social norms, the breakdown of mechanisms of social control. So the sociologist Stephen Full notes this represented for sociology a break from both speculative philosophy, and here Full's referring to the rationalizing or the rationalism used in terms of its underpinning of classical criminology, which we looked at in week 3. So this is a rejection of that approach. It's also a rejection of the evolutionary theorizing, the Lombrosian approach that we looked at last week, towards what Full has called a conjecture of two factors: a decade of unprecedented social change and the managerial response of an emerging professional class of technical problem solvers to problems brought about by such change. So what are these unprecedented social changes? Urbanization. Here we have urban population as a percentage of U.S. total. We can see within less than half a century an almost total inversion of a population that at one point as late as the 1870s had been a majority rural agrarian to the 1930s, where we see almost 70% of the American population now living in or very close to major urban centers. Industrialization, we have a 700% increase from the 1870s to 1920, and the gross national product of the United States. This is also reflected in employment by industry, where we see, not surprisingly, agriculture follow these other trends, being the dominant mode of employment and industry in the United States up into the turn of the 20th century, where we finally see it eclipsed by manufacturing. We also see corresponding rises in trades and railroads. It's notable, it's worth pointing out as well, it's not only employment by sector that was important, but it was the way that manufacturing changed that was really important in terms of social organization and the development of social disorganization approach to the study of crime and delinquency. The growth of mass production, set forth first by Taylor but perfected by Henry Ford, significantly altered life for Americans, both in their workplaces but also in the development of what we call today mass consumerism. Finally, if we look at immigration in the United States, we see again an obvious correlation where immigrants were used for skilled or unskilled labor, such as the building of railroads, garments, heavy industry. So these waves of immigration follow a boom and bust cycle where you have massive periods of growth and then either massive recessions, depressions, or in the case of the total dip in the early 20th century, the first one being World War I, the second one being World War II. So the early 20th century up through the 1920s and the massive growth of industrialization, urbanization, etc., served to solidify three distinct classes. Prior to this, you had had a much more agrarian type of society. You had smaller farmers, individual farmers. You had had the continuation of sharecropping in the South. You had had wealthy urbanites largely in the Northeast, as well as wealthy landowners throughout much of the East Coast. But the massive movement to cities and the massive industrialization really transforms the American social class around these three classes: the working class, the managerial class, and the elites. The working class are comprised of both new immigrants as well as older white immigrants. And this brings a lot of conflict. And this term nativism, there's a link to it there, where successive waves of immigrants are often thought of as not only unwelcome, but in many cases not white. So there's always been a racial or ethnic component to the type of xenophobia around the successive waves of immigration that came into neighborhoods that we'll look at in Lecture 2 that were often poor, dilapidated, without proper resources or social structures, institutions, etc. Strong labor suppression as well. The United States has always had a history of suppressing labor in ways that allowed it to continue the exploitation or the successive waves of immigration or the quest for ever cheaper exploitable labor. Crowded living conditions with increased anonymity or social separation. So the working class in the 19-teens or 1920s would have been a largely exploitable class. We would have been talking about endemic poverty, high disease. Many new immigrants would have spoken little or no English, fundamentally separated from their homelands. So the sociologist Howard Zinn has noted in response to the misperception that the 1920s were a time of fabulous wealth, or the Roaring Twenties as they're often called. There's some truth, he says, to the standard picture of the 20s as a time of prosperity and fun, but this prosperity and fun was concentrated at the top. From 22 to 29, real wages in manufacturing went up per capita only 1.4% a year. The holder of common stocks, on the other hand, gained about 16.4% a year, whereas 6 million families, or 42% of all Americans, made less than $1,000 a year. 0.1% of the families at the top received as much as these 42% at the bottom. Second class that really is solidified at the beginning of the 20th century is this managerial class. the managerial class tended to be white and more educated, at least high school degrees. College or university was not nearly as common as it is today, but some of the managerial class would have graduated into or from universities. They follow the growth of corporate wealth, right? But the managerial class isn't the one that primarily enriches themselves. They're the ones chartered with managing or organizing the development of large corporations, industry, government, and so on. So this is the development of this belief in bureaucratic, or when we say liberal, not in terms of partisan politics, but a view that applied science, applied knowledge can be used to solve most, if not all, not only problems of the natural world, things like disease, pathology, but also social problems as well, economic, homelessness, unemployment, crime, things of this nature. There's a strong belief, a strong optimism in this time, the power of bureaucratic solutions. So again, this is this rise of political liberalism, not partisan liberal, the way that we use in Australia to denote the Liberal Party, but liberalism and this belief that government, business, science can work together collectively to manage and solve economic, political, and social problems. So this is some way from today, right? We see much more of a pessimism today. There's a high degree of pessimism in Australia, the US, the UK, other countries around the ability of government or industry to solve problems. Finally, the last class that we look at is the elite, right? And you should probably know a little bit about this just from your basic Western history, where we see at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, the rise of the robber barons, the rise of what's often called the Gilded Age, massive amounts of wealth, right? People like Carnegie, Rockefeller, etc., whose wealth would easily rival, if not surpass, if adjusted for inflation, the wealth of people like Bill Gates, etc. So we see this annual U.S. income share, the top 1%, as high, if not higher, than today. But in any case, the larger point remains, where less than 1% of the population controlled a majority of corporate and private wealth. They have massive wealth inequality, particularly in cities like Chicago, where the poorest of the poor would have been living in slums, no water, no indoor plumbing, raw sewage in the streets, rampant disease, etc. And you would have had, on the other end, a very small number of people with extreme, in many cases, unimaginable amounts of wealth. So this really sets the background for what we'll talk about in our next lecture, which is the rise and development of the social disorganization perspective within this context of Chicago as a massively, massively transformed city over the 40 or 50 years from the late 1800s to early 1900s.